Yo, what's up YouTube? It's your boy Kylo coming back at it again with another video. And in today's video, we're talking about the Transcendental Argument for God, also known as TAG. In this video, we're going to cover what the argument is, what it aims to achieve, the commitments needed for the argument to go through, and then a few objections, the strongest objections, and why those objections are one which are sound. Now, in this video, we have yours truly, Cap.kg, which will be covering the relevant material. So without further ado, I'll let him introduce himself, and then we'll get into the content.
Yeah, my name is Cap.kg. I'm a debater on TikTok and Discord. I started out on the TikTok scene debating on TikTok Lives, and then over time I kind of transferred over to Discord debating. And I think Discord's a really good place to be for debating. I also still do TikTok Lives, so if you want to find me over there, you can look at my username, which is just Cap.kg. And my Discord is also Cap.kg. So without further ado, I think we can get into it.
Okay. Now, let's just first cover the base material, which would be something like what is the transcendental argument, kind of break down the substance of the argument, the form of the argument, and then what the argument looks to achieve.
Yeah, so the argument is an argument for God. It's a deductive argument. So basically the idea here is just, it wants to say something like if logical laws exist, then God exists. Logical laws do exist, obviously. Therefore God exists, right? And formally it's just modus ponens, where if you affirm the antecedent, you get the consequent, right? So it's obviously a valid argument. Nobody's going to be disputing that, right? No one's disputing the logic of the logic argument, which is almost like funny. But all the actual weight is on the first premise, which is just that without God, the logical laws couldn't exist. They couldn't be intelligible. You wouldn't be able to know about them, which is the whole ballgame. I think everything downstream of that premise is just an inference, right? It seems like it's more of an epistemic argument where you're asking like what has to be true for this thing to be possible in the first place. So you're asking what has to be presupposed for logic to make sense at all. The existence of logic, very specifically, which is something that I want to get into later. And I think there's more to be said about that very specific point, which is the existence of logic. We can get into that later. But yeah, I'm going to pass it back over to Kylo. That's just the standard understanding of the transcendental argument for God.
Now, for those who are just looking into the argument, maybe have ran past the argument, even may run the argument, let's just cover a few basic terminologies that people need to prepare to hear when they're hearing this argument. Things like necessary preconditions and, what's needed for X and things of that nature. Cover some of the base terms for this argument and what those terms mean.
Okay, so necessary precondition just means that this thing is needed for something else to occur or exist. There's a couple of ways you can imagine it. So it's kind of this type of counterfactual dependency relation. And all that means is just that if X doesn't obtain, then Y doesn't obtain. And then it seems like X will be the precondition for Y, right? There's other understandings of necessary precondition. Like there's this type of biconditional understanding of it, which will be important for later, which just means that X exists if and only if Y exists. And that's kind of the understanding there. And then there's obviously other understandings of precondition, like causal understandings, where this thing is causing something else to exist, and that's the only way that this thing can exist. And this type of terminology is used a lot in these type of debates on the transcendental argument. I think it's very useful to know this terminology. And yeah, I'm going to pass it right back over to Kylo.
So when we're putting people in positions to want to respond to the argument, know how to critique it, even if they're running the argument, they want to know what are the active defeaters. Let's cover a few ways that people can understand the argument, which you've covered, but not only that, but what to do when they get encounter with the argument, maybe a step-by-step guide of how to critique it, maybe a few questions to employ, or a few premises that you would want to deny and reasons to believe that those premises are deniable, things of that nature.
Yeah, so a commitment of the tag argument would just be that if atheism is true, you have no grounding for the existence of logic, right? Because again, God is this type of thing which is needed for logic to occur. I think this is the point where I think the argument actually falls apart. The common move presupps make, and presupp here is in reference towards presuppositionalist, which is just a fancy term for people who like to run tag. the common move presuppositionalists make is they say, well, okay, you're using logic right now to talk to me, so tell me what grounds it. Where does it come from? On atheism, right? And the implication is you're stuck because you either say nothing grounds it, and that sounds arbitrary, or you appeal to something abstract, and now you've basically smuggled in this type of maybe you want to say Platonic realm that you can't account for either. But here's the thing about that. Right? I don't think we have to play that game at all, because I don't think I need to grant the premise buried into the question. The question assumes that logic is this kind of thing that has an ontological status, right? Something that has an independent mode of existence, right? An entity, an object, that then needs some further metaphysical explanation or this type of anchor to hold it in place. That's already doing a ton of work before we've even gotten to God, right? Because it seems like that's an assumption about the ontological status of logical laws, and it's absolutely not something I'm prepared to sign on to just because I use logic. And there's a totally coherent alternative view as well, which is called conceptualism, or even just like a rules-based or normative view of logic, where logical laws aren't these kind of things that are like floating out there, or have this type of ontological status or mode of being. Under conceptualism, they take logic to be descriptions of how the world works, or even descriptions of how coherent inferences have to work, right? Given what concepts like negation, identity, and conjunction actually mean, right? So you can imagine it like the rules of chess, right? The rules of chess is constitutive of what pieces can do inside the system, and the system is made by minds, right? And we're not saying that it's arbitrary like chess. All we're saying here is that the what grounds it question is a category error if logic is this type of structural or conceptual tool rather than this type of entity that floats around and exists, right? So you're kind of denying the premise that logic exists in this way. I do want to flag this before someone else does, that this is a substantive philosophy position. It's very contentious, and I do owe a justification for this rather than asserting it. So I'm going to give some reason as to why I think this. The justification is basically as follows. So the alternative generates way more problems than it solves. If we take logic to be this type of thing that exists abstractly, or aspatial, atemporal, and can't cause anything, you get stuck with a version of what's called the Banach-Raff problem, right? Which is an epistemic problem, right? Which is the question of, well, if we can't see it, if it can't cause anything, and we can't really perceive it in this way, right? How do we have epistemic access to it, right? I also think you get stuck with the question of what it even means for a law to exist, independent of any mind instantiating or using it, right? The conceptualist reading dissolves that kind of epistemic problem, right? Because logic is intelligible as a feature of thought and language without positing this type of extra layer. So I think the burden, the epistemic burden, right, is actually reversed here, right? The Platonic understanding or the abstract understanding about logic is the one that needs defending, and usually it's just assumed and not argued for by presuppositionalists. But let's say I do grant that premise, right? Let's say I give them the whole understanding that logic is real, mind independent, they need some type of grounding precondition. Even then, I don't understand, or I think the argument breaks, because if God is supposed to ground logic as a precondition, meaning logic can't exist without God, and presumably God is necessary, then logic can't fail to exist if God exists. So then it seems like what you actually have is a biconditional, right? In a biconditional, if we think about what a biconditional even is, it's a logical relation, right? It's a specific, well-defined logical connective with its own truth conditions, which is part of the kind of understanding of logic that's supposedly being grounded here. But then it seems like the biconditional relation, which is something that's supposed to be logical, if we're thinking about logic as something that exists, you need the logical category to be the kind of thing which exists to be available, intelligible, and doing work. So then it just seems like you need it before you can use it to explain how logic gets grounded, which is not only circular, it seems like that's impossible because things can't ground themselves. At least if we take the kind of ground causal axioms, right? The standard causal axioms, which there seems like there's an understanding of asymmetry, right? When there's a causal relation. So it seems like it's circular in the most literal way possible. And now you're either in an infinite regress, or you just have to like quietly admit that at least some logical structure is available independently of God's grounding activity, in which case the preconditioned claim is just straight up false, which is just the defeater, right? You can reject the abstract premise, which is just that logic exists on independent grounds. And even if you don't, the grounding relation itself is impossible because it has to presuppose logical categories to even get off the ground. So I think both premises just fail in the argument. That's kind of a step-by-step understanding, a structural understanding of what the argument is, some of the commitments, and why those commitments lead to this type of impossibility.
Now, before we kind of wrap
Yeah, I'm
this
going to pass
up,
it back over to Kyla now.
I'm curious on your thoughts for those theists who say something like this. A lot of these premises are true in virtue of.
Hello?
Can you hear me? Oh, okay, 1 second. Yeah, my apologies. My mic was muted. But now I kind of want to inquire on your thoughts for those presuppositions who say a lot of these premises are true in virtue of the impossibility of the contrary. I know a lot of the debaters have heard that argument, and for those who might not have an understanding how to respond to that, how would you respond to the impossibility of the contrary talk?
Yeah, it just seems like, again, earlier, like the alternative view that I mentioned just is coherent.
All right. So I mean, guys, you guys got an overview of the main view, a step-by-step guide on how to debunk the view, relevant things to be saying in that conversation. If you guys appreciate and use these type of videos, we encourage you guys to drop a comment, drop a like, share the video out, things of that nature. And I'll let Kat maybe give a last closing statement. He kind of told you guys in the intro, but maybe relevant places you guys can find him, find his channel. That'll be linked below. Cap, you got it.
Well, before I give the outro, I think there's further to be said about the impossibility talk. It seems like when they say it's impossible, they're just saying that the alternative view isn't coherent, but it is coherent. Like there's no contradiction, so that just debunks that claim entirely. And yeah, I think that's about it. You can find me on YouTube at Cap Debates. You can find me on TikTok and Discord at cap.kg. And yeah, I think I just showed you guys how to defeat the transcendental argument for God.